the future really is in looking to all the technology options that are available to us and hybridizing them to find the sweet spot.
Hello, and welcome to another one-to-one mining investment APAC online content session. Today, to share what's happening in the world of hydrogen, we have Daniel Roberts, leader, Hydrogen Energy Systems Future of Science platform at CSIRO.
Great, and thanks Amy, and thanks One-to-One Group for the chance to talk to you today about hydrogen energy systems with a bit of a lean, I guess, towards their emerging relevance in the mining and related industrial sectors. I am Daniel Roberts. I'm from CSIRO, which is Australia's national science agency. We're a large, about 5,000 strong organisation, partially government funded, do a lot of applied research with our industry and university and government collaborators right across the industry sectors of relevance to Australia. I'm with our energy business and I lead our Hydrogen Energy Systems Future Science platform. I'm coming to you today from Queensland on the east coast of Australia in the western suburbs of its capital, Brisbane, the traditional land of the Agri and Turrbal people. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, and anyone who may be dialing in at some point to listen to this call. I guess this is the overview of what I'm going to step through today in this info call. People often want to know why we're talking about hydrogen again, and if it's real this time. Is it more than hype? I'll take you through what I think is the answer to that question. I'll talk a little bit about some of the pathways that are emerging, their different implications with regards to emissions, and how some of those are panning out in some of the sectors of relevance to the people who might be dialing in to listen to this. We are a research agency, and so we do like to finish these discussions with where to from here, because we wouldn't be heavily invested in spaces which were ready to go and didn't have any more work to do. So hydrogen energy systems, depending on what you've been doing or where you've been casting your mind, have been around for quite some time. But really, their use in an industrial scale has been as a feedstock for many years, 100 years or perhaps even more. And that industrial hydrogen use has been largely in sectors around oil refining, production of ammonia for fertilizers and explosives, methanol production, and a whole range of other applications. In those scenarios, it's usually produced in the industrial complex, in the oil refinery, in the Haber-Bosch plant, for example, where it's needed. And that production is usually from steam reforming of natural gas or the gasification of coal. And that has associated with it a lot of CO2 emissions. And when we talk about hydrogen, I guess in the modern energy context, we're talking about hydrogen for different uses. Although, as we move down the decarbonisation pathway, those existing applications of hydrogen have the chance to contribute to emissions reduction as well. Hydrogen energy usually leads people to think about mobility, cars, perhaps buses if they've been in a city which has had a bus trial in the last decade or so. And that's certainly the case, but it's much more than that now. And it transcends industry sectors. It links into domestic use, electricity and grid uses, a whole range of industrial uses, and of course opens up this prospect for countries which are endowed with significant renewable resources to store and export that renewable energy as the world seeks to decarbonise. So it's broad and it's complicated, and almost every sector that has energy and emissions associated with it has a chance to have at least some benefit from what's emerging in the hydrogen area. Why, though, are we talking about hydrogen again? And depending on how long you've been around, will depend on how many times you've had hydrogen thrust upon you as a solution. Many of us think it's different this time, and a few things have changed, I think, to support that. One is this notion of global market pool. Japan, Korea, for example, have got energy strategies which rely heavily on imported low carbon hydrogen to achieve those goals. Germany even wants to look at importing renewable hydrogen from Australia as part of its plans to transition and decarbonise. And these strategies are emerging because we're seeing fairly mature technologies in some key areas. Fuel cell electric vehicles, the fuel cell itself has become efficient and light. The tanks to store the hydrogen, some of the materials advances there have been quite significant. And we now see fuel cell electric vehicles on the streets in cities around the world. Making the hydrogen from non-fossil fuel sources has also become achievable in terms of the cost of electrolyzers, in particular the PEM electrolyzers, which are somewhat flexible and modular and distributable in the context of renewable energy and grids. And we, of course, know that the costs of renewable electricity generators has come down significantly. I guess the other aspect of that is this notion of storing and moving it around. And we've seen some technologies emerge there around liquid hydrogen tankers, new materials for storage, ammonia pathways are now real. And this opens up the prospect of storing and moving the hydrogen around at costs which are now in that range of being on the trajectory, I guess, for many strategies and plans. And this is all happening in the context of a bit of a shift, I think, in what people want to see in terms of the emissions intensity of their energy. This is reflected here in Australia, where there is now a national hydrogen strategy endorsed by all of the states. The federal government is supporting hydrogen demonstration through grant funding and investment activities through our so-called Green Bank. And we're seeing companies such as Fortescue quite famously pivot from being an iron ore company to a company with ambitions to be a global scale green energy company. And so all this together really does make many of us think that this time it's probably for real. It's worth touching on the different pathways available to us. The pathway for hydrogen production that I mentioned at the outset there, where we make hydrogen from gas or from coal, is nowadays called grey or black or brown, depending on which version of gas or coal it's made from. That, of course, is not usually consistent with the notion of hydrogen as a clean energy transition option because of the CO2 emissions associated with it. And so if those emissions are to be captured and stored or used, then the hydrogen produced is called blue hydrogen. And there's a lot of interest in blue hydrogen, in particular from natural gas companies who are trying to figure out how best to navigate a future which is likely to be featuring hydrogen significantly. I think most of the interest, though, in terms of hydrogen as a long-term decarbonisation vector is what's called green hydrogen, which is hydrogen made from renewables. Now, most of that is renewable electricity driving an electrolyzer to make hydrogen. There are some pathways where we can take renewable waste streams such as agricultural waste or wood chip waste or even urban waste and turn that into hydrogen. But certainly most of the interest is around this electrolysis pathway. And that's where we're seeing a lot of advances in terms of electrolyzer technology, in terms of cost and scale. And that's going to continue to go down and increase respectively as we see more and more deployment. Once you've made this hydrogen, of course, we can do lots of different things with it. It can be used as an energy storage pathway. But it could function in a grid a bit like a battery, but for much longer timeframes and potentially larger, much longer storage timeframes and potentially longer generation timeframes as well. And I guess the benefit there is twofold. Electrolyzers are pretty flexible loads on the grid, so they can actually be used to help balance out demand by turning them up and down as renewables come and go, but also as a generation pathway in its own right. Mobility, I think many are familiar with, and I've touched on already. but there are a range of other applications for hydrogen as well. I've mentioned grid services and storage. Remote area power is of interest, I think, in particular in the mining space, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on, as is the opportunity for decarbonising industries, which hitherto I think have been seen as difficult to decarbonise, and I'll touch on that. And of course, there's this notion of storing of hydrogen, either as ammonia or methanol or methane, liquid hydrogen or organic hydrogen carriers. There's a whole range of options here, and transporting it around the world. And the prospect of a renewable energy export industry is really piquing the interest of many in this space. When we turn to mining, that story is consistent, and there are some really interesting things emerging in this space. I don't think anyone tuning into this session will not appreciate the energy demands of mining, and especially in Australia, where we see a lot of use of diesel, which, especially when we consider the remoteness of some of these mine sites and the off-grid nature of them, is very costly, it's quite CO2 intensive, and there are other issues around the use of diesel, which go beyond carbon and cost. And so we are seeing some early movement in the mining sector around uptake of hydrogen technologies. And this is in part because it's a fairly high cost competitor in that space already. I think some of the applications for hydrogen, whether I guess the incumbent is a little has a smaller margin associated with it. Things such as natural gas replacement in some manufacturing industries might take a bit more time and might need the costs to come down. But certainly mining is amongst the early movers in this space. And we see that in things such as the development of hydrogen-powered mining trucks. There's some conversion projects going on around the world. This is particularly amenable to those trucks which are the hybrid diesel electric drivetrain, and that has an analogue in rail as well, where we're seeing some conversions and some demonstrations, in particular in Europe, around hydrogen-powered rail. The prospect of producing the hydrogen on site and using it to power some of these very large vehicles is really quite interesting. Here in Australia, we're seeing some early movement by Fortescue, not so much at the moment, at least, in their large heavy haul vehicles, but they are now going down the path of using hydrogen in some of their coaches for moving people around their sites. Now, that's a really it's a fairly useful place to start, I think, as they develop their own familiarity with some of the technology combinations needed to deliver a renewable hydrogen transport fleet, and also allows them to build on some really strategic partnerships with various players in the hydrogen space, including, of course, CSIRO, as they partner with us to commercialise some key technologies across the value chain. I always like to show this example when I'm talking about mining, even more broadly, that hydrogen, because it shows that we're not necessarily talking about a competition here between different storage technologies or different mobility technologies. And the future really is in looking to all the technology options that are available to us and hybridizing them to find the sweet spot. And the Glencore Raglan mine up in Canada, I think, is a great example of that. It's got a couple of megawatt scale wind turbines in, I think, is a 29 or 30 megawatt microgrid, which runs the mine. And those wind turbines are hooked up to a multi-technology energy storage system, which of course has a hydrogen system, like I touched on earlier, with an electrolysis and a storage component, along with a fuel cell generation component, but also a flywheel and a battery. And together, those three approaches to storage really do offer them the, I guess, reliability and flexibility to show how we can integrate some of these technologies with intermittent renewables and have a big impact on things like, in this case, millions of litres of diesel a year. So I think that's a really great story, and there are analogues for that, I suspect, all around the world. People do talk a lot about green steel, and that's certainly a tantalizing prospect. I think more broadly, the iron and steelmaking sector can benefit a lot from some of the opportunities that hydrogen affords, not just in the steel making itself, but also more broadly. And I think some of the quality increasing activities around iron ore beneficiation, which rely on natural gas and thermally driven processes, are fairly amenable to conversion to hydrogen. The traditional steelmaking path using a blast furnace, we have seen coming out of Europe already some demonstration activities of hydrogen being used, but of course, blast furnaces are difficult to go green, as it were, because of the reliance of that technology on coke and some of the carbon implications of that. While hydrogen is a very good heat source and a very good reductant, it's difficult for it to fulfill some of those structural properties of coke in the blast furnace. So there's some other innovation required there. But certainly by using hydrogen to increase the quality of what goes into a blast furnace, and perhaps in the tuyeres as a heat source, which is what we've seen in Europe, there's an opportunity for some quite significant CO2 reductions. The emerging steelmaking pathways, such as electric arc furnace, linked up perhaps or separate from direct reduction of iron, very amenable to hydrogen. These low temperature reductions are quite suited to hydrogen, given its strongly reducing nature. And of course, when linked up with an EAF run on renewable electricity, that's where the opportunity for zero emission steel can be realised. So lots to think about there. Gas networks, I've stuck in here because it shows how it doesn't need to be green or nothing. Some of these demonstration projects here in Australia are taking green hydrogen and injecting them into natural gas grids at a few percent, just to become familiar, I guess, with the production stage. But that's supporting, a reasonable emissions reduction across their networks without changing infrastructure. And these projects, as they grow, will seek to transition some of these gas applications from a few percent renewable hydrogen to much higher percentages. And again, there's analogues for this around the world. In particular, for example, in the north of England. So where to from here? I think something that is often spoken about as we talk about all these remarkable things that hydrogen pathways can offer us in terms of decarbonisation of electricity, of transport, of mining, of minerals processing, of steel making, of ammonia production, etc., is this challenge of scale. And a year or two ago, the Hydrogen Council put out a report talking about their predictions for what the global hydrogen demand might be. And as you can see here, it's fairly large. This is there's a few predictions like this around. This is one of the largest, I guess, in terms of the scale, but the point is clear, and that is that on top of the existing uses of hydrogen, which I've spoken about around oil refining and ammonia production, we see this significant growth in green or low carbon hydrogen in those application spaces that I spoke about. A 10 times increase in what we saw in 2015 in terms of hydrogen use. Almost all of that required to be carbon free, which is either renewable or one of those fossil sources of hydrogen coupled with CO2 capture and storage. Now, there's significant discussion and debate around the value of a so-called blue hydrogen pathway to support a cost-effective transition. Lots of people think that's a really important part of doing it. Others suggest that if it's not green, it's not worth doing. And there are a range of perspectives in between that. But the point is, we're going to need a lot of hydrogen. And if you sit back and think about it, that's an awful lot of windmills and PV to support that. And so what we're looking at in terms of our sort of R&D supporting some of these technologies, it is around cost reduction. That's a critical aspect of becoming competitive with some of the incumbent technologies. But it's also about reducing process steps and increasing the efficiencies of some of these pathways so that we don't need, or we can make the hydrogen that we need with less demand for renewable energy. That's going to get us part of the way. Diversification is also going to help by bringing together sectors that haven't traditionally worked together. Is the chance to really broaden our base for hydrogen production. A good example that I like to talk about is the waste management sector, which there's a range of pathways for waste management of all kinds to participate in low carbon hydrogen production, and as well as making hydrogen to serve the demand. This is a really interesting way of perhaps even shifting the economics of waste, of emerging waste management pathways to really up the game in that sector as well. So some interesting stuff there. But of course, demonstration, doing some of this stuff at scale, de-risking supply chains and showing that it's possible is really what has to happen. And CSIRO, we're doing our bit via our recently launched hydrogen industry mission, and with our partners in industry and government, really hoping to see some of these large projects which are now being planned in Australia, both for renewable hydrogen production in ammonia applications, but also in natural gas and mobility applications, really come to fruition. So Amy, thanks for that. I'll leave it there.